Marshall here. Welcome back to the video version of the Realignment podcast. My guest today is the author Rikki Schlott. She's co-authored The Canceling of the American Mind, out today. This conversation around cancel culture, where we've ended up as a society, what norms should be, how campuses fit in, and of course, how employers should respond to cancellation moments is just incredibly relevant, especially coming out of the controversies on college campuses over statements students, undergrads, law students, etc., made about Hamas's acts of terrorism. This is a really interesting moment in our society as we're trying to kind of figure out, now that we've clearly recognized there was excess in this category in the 2010s, where are we going to end up? A conversation with Rikki, it's all about where we agree and disagree on the path moving forward. Hope you all enjoy the conversation and definitely let me know what you think in the show notes. Rikki Schlott, welcome to the Realignment.
Thanks so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to chat with you. This is a really interesting moment to have a conversation about cancel culture, not just because for the past year or so, it's been clear that the narrative around cancel culture has kind of shifted in a couple of different ways, but obviously this is coming out of the week where a bunch of incidents on American campuses kind of took the cancel culture discussion in a different direction. So let's just start at a very basic level. Love to hear your definition of cancel culture.
Yep. So we define cancel culture as attempts to deplatform or punish people for their speech starting in 2014 onwards, when it seems to have taken certainly a different medium than historically it may have in the past with social media, and also just the culture of conformity and of self-censorship that arises from all those attempts. Because I think it's important to note that every single cancellation that does take place obviously reverberates in the community around it, and has a lot of like unspoken consequences of just self-censorship and the lack of willingness to tread the same ground that someone else may have been canceled for.
So I was going to ask you about this because specifically, in the book, the two of you argue that cancel culture is a new phenomenon. And obviously we could bring up McCarthyism in the 50s, other aspects of conformity in American history. But I feel as if in your definition, the key differentiator is the social media aspect, correct? Is that how you would differentiate those two eras?
Yeah, I mean, I think that social media and the way there's a lot of different impacts of social media on illiberalism and censorship. I mean, I think it gives it an element of permanence because it's always in the public record. It's far more universal. So if someone on some random campus gets tarnished or pulled down, that might be something that is relevant to their community, but now it has global implications. But I think, I mean, we think that cancel culture has been able to take hold in the form that it has, and with the kind of grip that it does, because it's almost like the memification of something that is very successful and replicable. And on social media, it's a really great way to pull down your opponents without actually having to engage with them in any way, period. And so we think that social media has really allowed illiberalism to take an even more insidious and mobbish form than perhaps it has been able to in the past.
Yeah, and your usage of meme there is really interesting because, as folks know, a meme isn't just like a cartoon or a GIF online. It's a term coined by Richard Dawkins. So it's the rapid spread of an idea or a concept across people, and obviously on social media and Twitter, that could really spread really quickly. So I actually would like to ask, though, try to put this lightly, why shouldn't people with bad or dangerous ideas be either censored? And I don't mean censored by the government. I just mean if I hold Nazi-like ideas, I think it's completely compatible with liberalism for me to be shunned, not hired by people in the community. I wouldn't want my kids going over to the house of like the Nazi house, even if like the actual children of the Nazi were perfectly nice at school. What is the matter with that at a basic level?
I mean, I think the real question is, what kind of society do we want to live in? And is it a society in which we attach people's ideas to their character and their core person, or a society in which we believe in engaging with viewpoints, even ones that we might find condemnable. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be best friends with somebody who has a completely divergent viewpoint of yours, but especially in institutions that are knowledge producing, I think that there's a real a real benefit to allowing discourse to exist as it does. I think social media, and especially the social media age, has demonstrated that canceling people and throwing them off of platforms or quarantining them into different smaller crevices where bad ideas can fester is actually something that potentially radicalizes people, makes them even more extreme in the first place. And I think I mean, canceling people and banishing them to the corners and fringes of society is something that I think only perpetuates polarization. It makes people even more extreme. I mean, we have data from the NCRI, and I think it's the National Contagion or Network Contagion Research Institute, which I should get in my head a little bit better. But it basically they're a group of researchers who've been able to determine that every time there was a mass ban of fringe accounts and alt-right accounts on Twitter, that there was a consistent pattern of massive upticks of people moving to platforms like Gab that are more extreme and more insular. And I think it's an important demonstration of the fact that censoring and shunning bad views does not make them go away. It just makes them fester. It makes them go underground. I think sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I mean, certainly there's freedom of association, and there's as a private employer, you have every right to associate yourself with whatever employee you so choose. But I think that we should err on the side of removing this kind of like intractable sense that your views define you as a person, because I think we've all changed. And I think that if we want to live in a society where we can actually have important conversations, it's a matter of allowing viewpoints to be aired without forever ruining people's reputations. And I'd prefer to live in that kind of world personally.
It's interesting because as I'm thinking kind of my own definition of like what's just like the worst case of cancel culture, it's really the weaponization of platforms, in a way, especially to people who we could describe like as civilians. So like, we're not talking about podcasters or YouTubers or people who make a living, or even academics, people who like live in the realm of ideas, but just like a normal person said something on Twitter 10 or 12 years ago, that then is discovered, that then is then amplified, and that then is used in a weaponized way. Because I guess, obviously, like we should disagree or we disagree. I do think, though, that there are just some ideas that like do define you. So if I'm a Nazi in the year 2023, I think that idea actually does define me as a person. And I feel as if arguing against that kind of sets us up for people who I think use cancel culture in bad faith ways to basically say, all we're saying is Nazis should be socially censored by the community. And I think they're actually saying something much worse than that. But as a baseline level, I think it's fair to say that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that also the question though does become the subjectivity of saying, I mean, of course, we're talking about extreme examples here, but as soon as you adopt a culture where people are torn down unceremoniously, the Overton window of acceptable viewpoints shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, especially in a place like a college campus, to the point where you have people that are getting canceled for ridiculously innocuous things. So I think that, the often a slippery slope is defined or referred to as a fallacy, but I don't think that in the case of censorship, that's actually the case. I think that there's a very slippery slope, and the more that attaching viewpoints to people's person takes place, the more fear and conformity takes place, and then the smaller and smaller and smaller the realm of acceptable viewpoints becomes. And I think, an example that was so shocking in 2015 was Nicholas and Erica Christakis at Yale, where there was an edict that came down from a student government board of some sort saying, like, be careful. This was back in 2015. Be careful about what Halloween costumes you wear, because it could be offensive to someone. And Erica Christakis wrote a really level-headed email about how, like, maybe we just shouldn't, as a school, be censoring what young adults who are at one of the best schools in the country are doing and saying, and allow them to work that out for themselves. And if they're offended, to have a conversation about it and not have some weird like university sanctioned list of things that you can be for Halloween. And there was this viral video that my co-author Greg, actually, he happened to be on campus that day, and he took a video of Nicholas Christakis, who is also a professor there, Erica's husband, being screamed at and yelled at and torn down for his, not even his own view, his wife's view. And so I think that example, I mean, was shocking in 2015. and 2023, it's probably not anymore, because we've seen so many really unceremonious takedowns of people with perfectly reasonable viewpoints. But I think if you allow society to move towards a place where censorship is acceptable in more and more spheres, then eventually you end up in a place where something as innocuous as that is beyond the pale.
Yeah, and I'm not just trying to like play gotcha here, because I think the terms really matter, but I'd like to know what censorship means, right? Because on the one hand, if we're talking about social media platforms, I think censorship is pretty clear. Shadow banning, doxing, especially in doxing as a means of like increasing fear of your safety or like notoriety, like this or this or that, and definitely taking down social media accounts. I get that, but I get the sense that that you and Greg are pretty libertarian. And I think that's kind of a way of like understanding kind of the actually interesting debate, which is like, what is the difference between our private thoughts, our private actions, and then government, and then like big tech platforms? And I think on a governmental level, I don't think we, for a variety of reasons, or Germany, where it's just like illegal to own Mein Kampf and like, hold Nazi memorabilia. I don't think that vision is compatible with the United States. And I also am uncomfortable with social media platforms going too far in one direction. But I just kind of worry that me thinking, oh yeah, like I would never debate a Nazi like that. I worry about that being categorized as like censorship, or me being unwilling to engage with ideas, because I think sometimes ideas are just bad and shouldn't be engaged with. So kind of help me work through that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously Greg and I, we part of our definition, we define it as being torn down for speech that is or would be protected by the First Amendment, which obviously in the realm of a government agency or a public employee, that's one thing where you do have First Amendment protections. We argue that in other contexts in which people are perfectly within their legal rights to fire you or just disassociate themselves for you, that still does technically count as cancel culture. And I think, Greg and I are, I mean, he's the president and CEO of FIRE. I'm very much a libertarian, and champions of free speech are very often put in a really uncomfortable place when, for example, Greg, when he first joined FIRE, this was back in like around 2001, and his first major TV hits were defending the right of somebody to like say grotesquely inappropriate things about 9/11 as the rubble was still smoking. And I think that it takes I've learned quite a lot from him, because we have different political viewpoints, and I've seen him defend people who my gut instinct is like, yes, Greg, go ahead. And then I see him defend people where I'm like, oh my God, that idea is so beyond the pale. But he's really taught me the importance of being able to distill that principle from your own viewpoints in a way that I think, our partnership in that book was super helpful, because we're calling out both right and left. But it also means, yes, sometimes it's tolerating views that are beyond the pale. Obviously, it doesn't mean, hire somebody who is diametrically opposed to your viewpoint in a job or a field where that's relevant necessarily. I mean, you as a private employer, that's your own prerogative, but it also means, if you disagree with someone, or if someone's beyond the pale, or if they vote for someone that you don't agree with, that's not an acceptable reason not to hire them and engage with them if that's not relevant to the world in which you're working together. And I think, that I worry that obviously there are exceptions where things are so extreme, and like, you have Putin walking around. I'm one of Putin's major generals, I believe, said that he was being canceled for invading Russia, which like that's not cancel culture. That's, I mean, we're not that extreme and pure
That's
in our
called society.
definition. Yeah, and I think that there's a really important difference and nuance between tearing down people and tearing down their ideas, and I think that we've totally lost that kind of binary of being able to attack ideas and not attack people. And that's the backbone of a healthy society. And I think sometimes it does mean, yes, even in like fringe and extreme instances, to really stay true to those principles, because I mean, we live in such a polarized moment right now where I think the demonstration is, if you don't do that, then we just continue to divide and splinter and move into our own crevices to the point where we can't even have a conversation, or let alone even like a common body of facts and knowledge. And it's truly an epistemic crisis that results if we can't have conversations about ideas.
No, and I don't think it's unfair for me to bring up Nazis, especially because if you're, the new CEO of Twitter, that's what you're actually having to adjudicate around in terms of like the advertising controversies. But I do think this is where your slippery slope point is so important. If we look over the past few years, the incidents that I worry about the most weren't, okay, Nazi walks into a building, says debate me, no one debates him or her, and then they're like, I got canceled. Like that hasn't been the problem. I think the
Yeah.
actual problem has been, this isn't my actual ideology, so I'm just playing someone here. Hey, like I'm a populist nationalist, and I think the EU is bad, and I think that the borders should be sealed, and I hold a variety of opinions that are definitely right wing. It's been very easy for critics of people who hold those point of views to then say, see, this world bizarro Marshall is being a Nazi now, and let's treat him accordingly. So it's really when these when I was saying Nazi earlier, I was being very, very precise with my language, but it's pretty clear that the realm of what that term came to mean and the way it was weaponized, I think really approximated the cancel culture thing you're worrying about.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say also even like the super extreme viewpoints, like getting rid of Alex Jones, for example. That's one of the when he got removed from Twitter and all the Infowars accounts were purged from Twitter. That's one of those instances that the NCRI found that there was a huge uptick in users moving to Gab at that point in time. And then on Gab, they could actually see that it went from like the word ban showed up in 0.1% of Gab like tweets or whatever their counterpart is posts on their platform. And then after every single one of these events where there's a mass censorship event on Twitter, the word ban swells to like 3% of all posts. So this is not just a matter of like the net number of people moving to these platforms, but also a matter of conversation. And I would say that looking back in the scheme of history, I mean, Twitter at one point in time, like a decade ago, their general manager was saying that the free speech wing of the free speech party. I mean, obviously you have the legal bounds of you can't incite violence, you can't dox someone, you can't meaningfully threaten them, you can't defame them, and we do have First Amendment standards that have been tailored to that. But as soon as you start saying, well, these alt-right accounts are beyond the pale, which I'm not saying they're not reprehensible. I'm sure there's stuff that these people were posting that I would be deeply offended by. But as soon as you do that, and then you do that again, and then you do that again, the span of viewpoints that's allowed on a social media company can narrow considerably, and you don't actually banish these people from the internet. And if anything, I would say it's even more dangerous that Alex Jones or someone like that is in their own little crevice, not actually being refuted. Like most of us in the normal day-to-day polite society don't really know what he's talking about, but there are still probably just as many, if not more, fans that he has that have moved into his little ecosphere or somewhere like Truth Social. I mean, booting Trump off of Twitter didn't make him any less powerful. It just gave him an echo chamber in which his viewpoints are even less refuted, and the rest of us don't really know what's happening in that world. And yet, here he is, the most formidable Republican candidate in 2024 at the moment. So I think, it takes a remarkable degree of like being able to remove yourself and your views from views that quite literally can be reprehensible, so long as they're not directly physically, literally dangerous or defamatory.
And I think what you just said is where this gets really difficult. Define when ideas get dangerous.
Physically dangerous. I mean, I mean, genuine incitement of violence. I mean, the First Amendment law. I'm fortunate that Greg is the expert in that sphere, and I am not. But we do have a huge body of case law and a huge amount of precedent that has demonstrated that free speech absolutism is not literally absolute in this country. And if I say go and hurt this person in a way that is actually actionable, like that is beyond the pale. If I defame someone in a way that shows gross negligence for the truth, that is beyond the pale. Our legal body of precedent says as much, and that is something that I think social media companies would benefit from actually embracing the fact that the courts have answered a lot of these questions for them. And the problem is, as soon as you put your finger on the scale, which I totally understand the instinct that a lot of these social media companies and platforms and professionals had, because I would feel deeply uncomfortable if I owned a platform on which really reprehensible, vile stuff was happening. But as soon as you open that up, the can of worms just there's no putting it back, in my opinion. Greg has a term called censorship gravity, which I found super interesting. He'd written about it in the past, and I used a different analogy in the book. But like essentially, we've spent such a relatively short span of time in the scheme of human history actually not burning our heretics in a way that I think is super profound. And he believes that there's a gravity pulling societies down towards censorship, and it takes a great degree of purposefulness and being able to remove yourself from the situation as a society with all citizens buying into it to actually resist that gravity towards censorship. Because I think anyone can kind of rationally reason themselves into fringe cases where they think like, oh, maybe it would just be worth not listening to that person or banishing them or getting them off social media. And I think it's analogous to like slouching. Like you need to, like if you're somebody who kind of from time to time might slouch down and then realize like, oh, I know I need to stand up. Like it takes a degree of fortitude and attention and personal buy-in to make sure that you don't slouch towards that more natural standard. And I think that the scheme of human history is a demonstration that unless we're very, very purposeful to resist just the slippery slope of censorship, that's where we're going to head towards quite quickly.
Seems like the problem, though, and this is something that Elon and the folks at Twitter's advertising team are trying to figure out right now, is we can talk about Twitter being the free speech wing of the free speech party all we want. There is one set of actors who are very not bought into that vision, and that actors are the advertisers. There's basically no major corporation that is interested in advertising on that version of Twitter. So I guess what would you say to the ad? Because that's where it gets like really, really interesting, where it's like, okay, sure, you could do it if your platform, Elon. But clearly there's a lot of resistance to companies and brands who need to pay the bills here being willing to sort of advertise on a platform that's built around that principle. So what would you say to advertisers who just don't, who at a literal level, like just don't care about philosophy? And I think obviously there's a bit of ideology there, but clearly they care about bottom line and reporting their bosses and those different dynamics.
I mean, I think that the problem with the Elon situation is that you're going from a context in which censorship was the status quo for a while on these platforms, and then having someone waltz in and say, oh, no, we're going to go back to the way that it was. But I would say back in 2012, when Twitter was saying we're the free speech wing of the free speech party, and before they'd instituted mass bans of alt-right accounts or InfoWars accounts and Russian bots and trolls and white nationalists, like all these people who I think most of society would agree are not savory in any way, shape, or form, like they had advertisers before. But the problem is once you open that can of worms and you say we're going to censor and we're essentially saying these are acceptable viewpoints and these aren't, and then you have someone come in and say, oh no, actually it's a free-for-all, like you can't put that back in. So I mean, I would say look back in recent history. A decade ago, there were advertisers on Twitter. I mean, it's not, I don't think it's particularly because these viewpoints are there that they're not advertising. I think that it's just the whole host of all the other external factors and issues with, Elon himself maybe and things that he's saying. But I wouldn't say that it's purely because there's less censorship on the platform that they're not willing to advertise.
What's your advice for Elon B? Because I actually really like the way you frame that in terms of this isn't 2012, it's after, 10 plus years. Like, what would your advice for Elon be? What would your advice to Elon and the new CEO be moving forward, considering your research and considering, I think, the fact that you all have a broad understanding of this?
Yeah, I mean, Greg wrote an open letter to Elon a while ago that I thought was really great, and I would refer anyone for
I'll
his
link to
viewpoint
that in
to
the show
that.
notes. Yeah.
Awesome. I would say from my vantage point, if I had been in his ear at this whole point in time, I would have said from day one, like you need to put the controls of censorship away, because I don't think any one single person can be in control of something as vast as Twitter or as vast as the public square like he has. And I think that he's made some really unfortunate missteps with certain specific censorship instances, like suppressing Substack links or I think pretty obviously retaliating against a journalist who did not tweet his specific location with the Elon jet controversy. I don't know if you were following that, but like there were instances where the censorship that he put forth were just very much in his own self-interest, which I would understand the instinct. If I were him, I'd probably be really hard pressed not to also retaliate against someone that I felt was like doxing me in the second degree. But I would say you can't be in control of this. Like this, it cannot ever be up to one person what is happening in the public square. Even the most principled person possible still has their own internal biases. And I think divesting that control to either a broader group of people or even frankly like an open source algorithm would be a better situation than him being able to kind of be a little bit of a tyrant from time to time, in my opinion, even if I'm sympathetic to a lot of his viewpoints on free speech.
It's interesting. I feel like you and I are just dancing around the fact that open Wild West adjacent free speech platforms are probably just not compatible with an advertising business model. Like, for example, let's put aside the Elon jet tracker because that was very, very personal. I think on a broad level, the reason why Elon censored Substack is because Elon with Twitter Blue or X Blue, whatever it's called now, he has the long form notes. People could write longer tweets. So not only do they want to keep people on the platform to maximize advertising dollars, but they actually want people who are using Substack to basically start using the longer tweet format as their version of Substack. So that's why he banned it once again for business reasons. So it's frustrating that they so botched at the start of the acquisition Twitter Blue, because a world where Twitter was driven by subscription revenue rather than making. So if instead it was 70% subscription revenue, 30% advertising, I think it'd be easier to make the decisions you're articulating rather than 90% advertising, 10% give or take subscriptions in those different bases. Because you just can't depend on advertising if your priority is speech maximization.
Mm-hmm. I mean, but I also would say that if someone manages to somehow turn the clock back to a like pre-2016 Twitter sort of platform where people genuinely, I mean, I would also tell Elon, much like Trump, like maybe a little less tweeting on the toilet and things that are not well thought through, because I think his own personal rhetoric is hurting the brand a little bit too. But if somebody was able to create a genuine viewpoint neutral public forum again, I would say like the only reason advertisers feel as though they have the choice to say like, oh, I don't really want to advertise on Twitter right now is because it's lost a part of the market share. There was the question of would Threads like supersede Twitter, which I don't think really
I think
happened.
that's been settled.
Yeah, I think that's been settled.
We're not trying to get an Instagram sponsorship deal here. It's not happening.
But I would say like if in a world in which we could actually develop a viewpoint neutral common ground to voice our viewpoints, like advertisers are going to come. It's just that it's just a matter of like, can somebody figure out how to turn back time, which I think is a really difficult thing to do. But I mean, I think business and bottom line is business and bottom line, and in the end, if there are eyeballs on a platform, there are going to be advertisers who want to reach those eyeballs. I just don't see a world in which someone says, "Oh, just because it's Elon, I can't advertise to the millions and millions of people."
Yeah, I mean, you would be surprised, because I think at least 30% of this is almost certainly something like that. I want to go back to something interesting you said, because I so love that you picked the Yale situation in 2015, because I think a lot of the way that most people tell the cancel culture story, especially people like me who don't like cancel culture, but are sympathetic to, I think, the stronger arguments that are put out is, look, this is all basically about Trump. After 2016, everyone kind of loses their mind. And now that Trump's not in office anymore, everything's going to calm down and we're all just going to kind of move on. But you said 2015, which means that, and I think Trump, and my actual take on this is the reason why we're in a moment where cancel culture is on clearly receding in the American body politics, is I think it's because Trump is no longer in office and Joe Biden is largely the type of Democrat where people are going to feel comfortable dialing it back. But my soapbox aside, 2015 is pre-Trump. So what was happening? Like what's the origin story if I can't just blame everything on Donald Trump?
I mean, I think that a lot of cancel culture, we think, Greg and I argue that the roots are in a liberalism that was just growing in academia for quite a while. But I think also I saw it burgeoning. I'm 23, so I was on social media from the time that I was 11. Unfortunately, I know every time I say that in an interview, my mom cringes because she was like, "I didn't want you on there," but I was on Tumblr in its earliest days, and I saw this all kind of incubating there, where you'd be in like weird fandoms and one person has the wrong take on some like ridiculous thing, and then it's just like a tear down and no one can talk to that person at all whatsoever. So I think a lot of it was social media fueled, and I there were the seedlings of it before. I do think, though, I don't think it's just Trump. I think it's a country and where a liberalism is acceptable, or at least where the populace is not truly dedicated to classical liberal ideals. If that country or nation is in an uncomfortable point in time or a divisive point in time, I think a liberalism flourishes. I think Trump was certainly the spark for it, but I think all the groundwork was set. We were in 2016, we were at such a point where I think a lot of young people didn't really understand the tenets of free speech, the tenets of classical liberalism, what it means to truly buy into a pluralistic democracy and a diverse democracy. And so I think that moment made things flare up. I would say 2020 was pretty much the same thing happening again with the pandemic, with the death of George Floyd, with all the social unrest going on at that point in time. The same thing of like, just the exact same explosion. And I think in 2024, even if Trump were completely out of the picture, being in a divisive moment like that in a country where free speech is losing its grip on American hearts, I think we can expect something pretty similar to come out of that.
In this last section, I kind of want to go over recent events, because I think this is actually, and this once again why I think the book is coming out at the right time. This book is its most interesting back in, I think, this year rather than just, a little earlier, because an opinion I've definitely changed on. I think it got very easy to basically dismiss the space that you're in as just like a cottage industry. Like, it's 2019, everyone and their cousin has like a cancel culture book. Like, there's your latest Fox News Jesse Waters situation. But I think the funny impact of this, and this is where you can kind of talk about the state of higher education, is that all these people were messaging me like, what were all of these like young people thinking, signing these crazy pro-Hamas statements? And my take is just, they spent 4 to 8 years at institutions where their ideas literally were not challenged. Not only not challenged, but actually clearly privileged above other ideas. Because there's a difference between whether or not I'm going to argue with you and whether or not the ideas you even hold in itself are like first before others. So I think it's just like I think we just saw like an example of kind of like the mass psychosis that happens with elite,
Yeah.
educated, ambitious people when they come out of an institution where these ideas are kind of really, really dominant. So I'd love for you to kind of speak to that side of things.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I know firsthand as someone who was on a college campus very recently. I was at NYU. I would have been the class of 2022. I ended up dropping out during the pandemic and just doing my own thing. But I would say there's something really scary about the tyranny of the minority sometimes on these campuses. Because when I was at NYU, when I was a freshman, I got there, you're 18, New York City of all places. It's very like strange place to be at that age alone with strangers that you're living with. And the last thing you want to do is be canceled or like lose friends. And so I got there and I was hiding my Thomas Sowell and Jordan Peterson books under my bed, which is so embarrassing to say in retrospect. But I was so scared to put myself out there politically or to lose friends or to have my roommates dislike me because of my viewpoints. And it wasn't until 2020 or 2021, in the wake of the pandemic, that I wrote an op-ed in the New York Post about how I felt that free speech on campus was in a really dire state. And that experience made me realize how there's an illusion of this community where everyone thinks the same way and where you're completely alone, because I wrote that and I had former like people that lived across the hall from me, people that were in classes with me, professors that I'd had classes with, and deans of departments at NYU reached out to me and say, "Oh, I agree with you, but just don't tell anyone we had this conversation, by the way." And I think there's such an illusion of one viewpoint being so dominating a campus like that. Like NYU is very progressive, and I'm sure that I'm in a very much a minority in my viewpoint as a center right libertarian. However, there are so many people who can sit in a room together and not realize that they think the same thing or that they might have some common ground because they're too afraid to put themselves out there in the first place. And so I would even go as far as to say, like, recently there was a Harvard Crimson editorial piece where they said that was the majority view of the editorial board, and they were responding to the fact that Harvard went from having one longer supplemental essay to five shorter ones in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling about affirmative action. And the editorial piece for the Harvard Crimson, their take was that that was actually going to disadvantage students of color or lower people from disadvantaged backgrounds who wanted to apply to Harvard because they couldn't possibly know how to condense their essays into a 200-word essay, which is just in my view, like really bizarre and kind of racist take to have. And also that they couldn't possibly have a response to a question about intellectual diversity, or sorry, no, an intellectual experience that they've had, because how the underprivileged people might not have an answer to that question, which is just such a tone deaf take in my view. And I was thinking to myself, like, is there any way that that is actually the majority viewpoint and in the Harvard editorial Crimson or the Harvard Crimson editorial board? And I think that's the sort of example of somebody probably waltzed in there. I mean, I'm guessing, but they said, like, oh, it's so offensive that they have a 200-word essay or word limit on the essays. And, are you going to be the person who's going to say, like, no, actually, I don't think that's racist? Or are you just going to be like, okay, I'll sign off on that? And I think there's the culture of conformity can allow really disturbing viewpoints to go unchallenged. And the worst thing is, I think that there are people who probably did sign on to letters feeling that pressure and I'm sure there are true believers on those campuses, but I'm sure that there are also people who felt too afraid to put themselves out there and to be the diverging viewpoint on something like that.
So I want to ask you then, what do you think about Rina Workman? They, using proper pronouns here, they signed a NYU Student Bar Association letter that they wrote, not just signed, but they actually wrote a letter that people should just go read it. I don't want to editorialize on it myself, but I interpreted the piece as being very, and most people did, as just very pro-Hamas. This isn't just, they wouldn't, denounce the actions of Hamas. They said basically good to go. pro-resistance, anything's justified. They ended up losing their job after law school because they were going into their 3L year after being a summer associate. Um, I tweeted about this before they lost their job, but I was like, look, they're going to lose their job. I think it's okay that they lost their job because I think there's just like a limit on societal actions that are just that it's completely okay not to support or hire someone who holds those views, especially at a firm that likely has a more of a decent number of Jews at it. So I'd love to hear just kind of your response to that and your advice to people like me and the leaders of the firm who obviously likely disagree with what your opinion is.
And so remind me, because I haven't done all my homework on this exact case, just because we're gearing up for the book tour at the moment. But this was somebody who had not yet started a job at that firm, right? Was it something for the summer?
They did a
Rescinded
summer
offer?
associate. Yeah, they did a summer associate thing last summer, had the full offer. Authors withdrawn. The offer was withdrawn in direct reference to writing and signing this statement. Because like the reason why I'm asking about this one specifically is and already you're seeing, I think, the conservative or even like center left version of cancel culture going too far. There's a bus that's driving around Cambridge at Harvard, which is saying, look at all the students who are members of these various student associations that signed these reprehensible anti-Israel letters. I think they're reprehensible, but I think there's just like there's a step change between someone who just writes under their own name horrible pro-Hamas things and someone who's just a part of a broader group. And I guess maybe this is just your inherent point that it's very easy for my very specific condemnation of Rhino Workman to translate into way too aggressive bullying of like silly undergrads. Because I think there's just like a gap in terms of those circumstances, but maybe it is just a slippery slope. But yeah, I'd love to hear just your broad thoughts as a kind of like a general rule.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is definitely a difficult one, and Greg and I have talked about like there's a world in which you could say like Harvey Weinstein was canceled, and that's not a world that we live in. Like that's people who genuinely have a reprehensible track record, and I think that there's a world in which I think it technically does fit our definition of cancel culture because it is a viewpoint. It's not directly inciting violence, but it is endorsing it. And I think, there's a question about like what sort of society do we want to live in? Is it just people who are directly saying like, yes, I support Hamas and violent atrocities? Is it someone who identifies as pro-Palestine or has a Palestinian flag? I do think the slippery slope is dangerous. And I would say, at least on this one, like it definitionally does fit our definition of cancel culture. So yes, I do think that a private employer, and especially a smaller employer as well, has their complete freedom of association rights, and that's a separate question. I don't think that there should be any sort of like legal protection for someone like this. But I would also say the way that some of the tactics going on with the response to, I mean, in my view, really reprehensible statements that have been signed, attack the idea and don't call for the employer to fire someone or don't contact someone's employer. Like I think that's a very different a different conversation, and I think that it's very easy in a world in which for the past decade that's just been the kind of go-to tactic for people in the kind of cancel culture camp, to tear people down, to contact their employer, to dox them, I mean, I've never seen until today like trucks driving around with undergrads' school photos on it. I mean, I think that's a little bit too far for sure. But I think, the conversation on social media, it would be a much healthier world to live in if we were to attack the viewpoint and the letter and not call their employment into question and call, that's the employer's prerogative and conversation. And I think is that the kind of society that we want to live in? And so long story short, yes, I think that's definitionally cancel culture, but yes, I think it's within the rights of the employer as well.
And Given everything you just said, a good place to close is there's a key takeaway from what you just said, I think is I wrote this down, context really matters. So for example, I think it really does matter that the law it's a service industry. It's a very well paid service industry, but it's a service job. Like you're hired to work for clients. And I think it's entirely defensible for the firm to say, look, listen, this is disastrous news for us. They know our firm has a reputation. They know we need to sell clients and do billable hours. That was just a poor sign of judgment, and we're just not going to do this. And this is a sign for all associates or future associates moving forward. But this would be different if they worked at Quiznos or Burger King. And I'm just sort of like, you know what? Like, it's disgusting that Burger King would employ this person, where in all actuality, it's not a service job. It's totally faceless. The reputation of Burger King would not be limited, but there have been cancellations like that. I think that's the key thing. It's really where it's really where it exceeds purely an institution acting in self-interest and actually goes towards trying to harm someone. And I think contacting, and look, and I think there are probably going to be people who contact Rhino's future employers and try to continue to cause career trouble. And I think that's just like the total, like, utter line cross. Because at that point, you're not teaching a lesson, you're not sending a message, you're actually just weaponizing and bullying someone.
Yeah, and I think you're entirely right that context is very important. Like, for example, if a journalistic outlet were to pull somebody off of a beat because they tweeted something that demonstrates that they're not able to be objective, that would not be cancel culture. That would be very relevant to the job that's at task and at hand. But I will say I think it's just, I am concerned, regardless of my own personal beliefs about this conflict. I am concerned that we could end up in a world where, just having a flag or being pro-Palestine or whatever the viewpoint might be is something that starts to get people torn down, which is obviously completely different from saying, like, yes, I endorse what's happening right now with the literal terrorism that's unfolding. But I think that, that line, censorship, I will say again, I think is a slippery slope, and we could end up in a place where the dividing lines are much less clear. Whereas right now, I think people coming out and saying, like, yes, I'm on the side of terrorism being perpetrated against civilians, that's one conversation. And I think that we just need to be very careful to not just paint with a broad brush and condemn people who have differing viewpoints, because, violence is one thing, but a viewpoint is another.
Actual last question. I worry that a lot of, and once again, you share these views with, Greg. So this isn't just, you as a not recent graduate, but like a person who attended, very, very, a great school, but
a recent dropout.
A recent,
no
I'm trying to find the right. I'm trying to find the right,
no,
the right
I'll
euphemism. Yeah. I worry that you too conflate broader American society with, like, the ideal of higher education. So for example, at the start of the episode, and you host a show called The Lost Debate, so you really should be doing this. This is your brand. On that, you're talking about how, like, look, when there are bad ideas, debate the ideas. Like, if there's a bad, like, evil, racist, misogynistic, terrible thing on Twitter, like, debate it, shout it down. It will be countered like this, and that. And I just kind of worry that in a lot of the edge cases, that just isn't how, like, society works. In the sense that, like, let's say you have, and I hate the case of, digging up the tweets of some high schooler 10 years later, and then getting them fired. But, like, if someone is, like, dropping the N-bomb on Twitter the year before, I'm sort of, and there's no, like, amorphous statute of limitations that's been passed, I'm sort of like, ooh, that one gets very, very complicated, because also that's not a debate. You kind of like, we're not going to debate, actually, maybe if it's a weird workplace, there could be a debate about free speech, but likely it's not, your boss isn't going to debate you about your public conduct. So I would just want you to close with, like, what is the difference between a college campus where, like, debate and ideas and the free exchange thereof and social media platforms, which, to your point, if your Twitter is saying you're the free speech wing of the free speech party, you are accepting that standard. What are the differences between these three spheres, and how should that guide how we move forward?
The social media sphere, the campus sphere, and the third one just being
and just workplace where
in the
like
world.
there are no debates, there are no ideas. There's just basic shit, to put it eloquently.
Yeah, I mean, there if you're an employer and one of your employees calls another employee fat, like you can fire them for that. Like this, the First Amendment standards are very different in the workplace, and I would defer to Greg and his expertise on how that is quite a different situation as an employer, that you're paying someone's paycheck and you can expect them to comport themselves in certain ways in social media. I mean, I think that's certainly one thing, but it's viewpoint oriented, and I don't think that using a slur is a viewpoint.
Good point.
And I also would say that you I would love to live in a world where we could just kind of tune out the unsavory ideas and just live in a happy, fluffy little bubble of people that are in the kind of moderate, sane middle. But I think that the past decade or so has just demonstrated that we're more divided than ever, that there's a meaningful plurality of Americans who believe that there are lizard people in control of the levers of society. And like, is it a better thing to let them talk about that in their weird little crevice of the internet and fester, and then like all of a sudden there's even more of them? Or is it a better thing to know the breadth of human opinion and civilian opinion in its reality, and to be able to confront that and maybe change hearts and minds in common spaces? And I would say I'd rather live in the place that's the latter. And that does mean, of course, you be friends with who you want to, hire who you want to. We're all private citizens and we can choose to engage with who we want to engage with. But I think as a society, we can all do our part to go back to those old idioms of like, to each their own, and it's a free country, and, to embrace the fact that we might need to be a little bit uncomfortable if we want to live in a truly diverse democracy, and that the only way that we can learn to coexist is if we can actually talk to people and meet them where they are. And yep, that means that sometimes you're going to be defending people that are fringe and make you uncomfortable. I mean, I was just on TV the other day defending the rights of Harvard students to say things that I think are despicable, but that's something that I need to put myself aside in the context of being a free speech champion. And I think that society needs to get a little more comfortable, not with its extremists and genuinely dangerous, violent people. That's one totally separate thing. And the First Amendment does have bounds that prevent speech from becoming actionable violence. But we need to be more comfortable in engaging with people on the fringe, because if we aren't, then I think the fringe becomes a larger and larger faction of society.
Well said. The book is The Canceling of the American Mind. Cancel culture undermines trust and threatens us all, but there is a solution. Rikki, thank you for joining me on The Realignment.
Thank you. Been a pleasure.